Express my gratitude to all the people that are here, some of them are not here, that are not just PhD students, some of them are doctors, are graduated, even when they are young, that has been working in academic and professional terms, and it's thanks to them that we could organize this meeting. First of all, you have been in contact with Ana Lara, probably, that was in contact also the emails, Carmen Trueba, that organized with Lorena Remusgo all the program and all the configuration, all the details that you have been in this Congress. Vanessa Jordá, that came from Reading, from the UK, but she was working extremely hard in these days and as well online. Isabel Sainz and Maria Cantero as well. Maria and Isabel Sainz. There are other people that are as well here, and some people that are not here, like José Antonio Alonso, that was in charge of all the web, the design of the web, the evaluation process, and the results. Julio Revuelta, that was answering the emails and sending my spam, massive spam. We had problems with the computer services. Marcos Fernandez, that is coming, that was in charge of connection with the press and with the media. Martin Roth, that unfortunately is not here, that was as well in terms of the international relation, the same Valeriano Martin, and Pedro Casares and Ingrid Mateo, that has been in charge of the institutional relations. All of them, I can see of all of them, 80% are doctors and are working in the department in different areas of this university. Más o menos.
I think everybody understood what I said. This implied the professional effort in different areas of this faculty, doctors, some of them are PhD students. They are all very young. They carried out different tasks that were fundamental to bring this meeting to reality. I am enormously grateful, and I would ask for an applause to all of them. Thank you.
We're starting the closing ceremony with two key speakers and two key chairmen. José Antonio Alonso from the Complutense University, Valpi Fitzgerald, Daniel Sotelsek from University of Alcalá, Madrid, and director of the Institute of Latin American Studies, and José Luis Machinea, that he was General Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America. So I will start with the chairman, Daniel Sotes, introducing José Luis Machinea.
Buenos días.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to start by thanking Daniel Diaz-Fuentes and all the people he has just mentioned, because they have supported us very much and they've organized this brilliant World Economy meeting in Santander. So this is a great opportunity for me to be here presenting Dr. Machinea's presentation called Quo Vadis, America Latina. I think José Luis Machinea doesn't need further presentation because of his merits, and his publications are known by everybody. But, well, just a few notes. He's a doctor by the University of Minnesota. He is a professor at the University of Itela and Buenos Aires, and he's also the head of Raúl Prebisch chair at the University of Alcalá. I think he's been involved in very deeply in academic activities, and Not only that, he was also the executive secretary of ECLAC and Deputy Secretary General of the UN. He was also the Ministry of Economy of the Republic of Argentina. He was the president also of the Argentinian Central Bank. He was the president of many other institutions. He's a specialist in many areas. But if there's something we like about Dr. Machinea is his vision about what's going on in Latin America and what will happen in the future. That's why he chose the title for his presentation. The title is Quo Vadis America Latina. I think it is a good choice because Latin America is no longer the focus of debate because fortunately for Latin America, it's not in the focus of the crisis, so therefore it's not in the focus of the macroeconomic debate. So we can say that the last years have been full of good news for Latin America. Now we have to wonder what happened in the recent history, what happened with the macroeconomic performances, and well, to see what the consequences of those advances were for the population. It's also true that this was true at least until not long ago, because now there are other issues arising in the region, and the reality is probably not the same today as in the period between 2003 and 2007. It wasn't the same before the crisis and after the crisis, but it's true that the crisis allowed us to evaluate vulnerability and how Latin America endured this macroeconomic tsunami. I think a good question for Dr. Machinea is what are the weaknesses of the region today in terms of trade, productive structure? There's some things that can probably be improved, and I'm sure he will explain it in more detail so that we can reflect on the Latin American reality. What is happening with social cohesion as well, with social structure? We have good figures regarding income, and well, there are a number of issues that have to do with how societies work in that region, what is going on with investment, tax systems, etc. There are many questions that he will probably mention during his presentation. And finally, I may wonder a couple of things or throw a couple of questions for debate. What is happening with the external debt that has been a constant threat for the region almost until the present? And the second question that I would like to pose is what we think about the return to production of primary goods. It's often talked about because Latin America is supposed to have a great opportunity to exploit its natural resources. How is that going to be managed? Well, probably Dr. Machinea can tell us more about that. I think Latin America comes from a lost decade. It just won 5 years, and the future is right there. There are a lot of issues and questions that we can reflect on. So without further delay, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Machinea for his presentation, Quo Vadis America Latina. Good morning. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, Professor Diaz-Fuentes in particular. It is a pleasure to share this panel with Valpe Fitzgerald, Daniel Sotelsek, and José Antonio Alonso. Daniel posed a lot of questions about Latin America, and in half an hour I will try to give you a few answers. I'm going to review some good things that happened in the region, and I'm going to pose also some questions with regard to the future. If I can find my presentation. I would like to start with the external context. What was the external context around Latin America? Here you have the exchange terms. The red line represents Latin America. And if you take 1990 as a reference, the improvement in exchange terms for Latin America was about 70%. I added two more countries, Venezuela and Chile, maybe because those two countries improved even more with regards to exchange terms. They moved from 40 to 160. They multiplied by 4 their exchange terms in 4 years. The figures for Chile are 2.5 or 3 times better. So this allows Latin America or South America, this has allowed it to increase, as you can see in this graph. The exchange terms in the whole of South America improved in about 60%, but in Argentina and Brazil, that improvement was only 30%. Take a look at the Andean countries. They improved by 80% the exchange terms. That means around 200% for Venezuela, 100% for Chile, and 60% for Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. Mexico didn't improve very much, and Central America went worse substantially. Why? Because they basically import oil and also food. So as a consequence, the import prices went up, and they had to compete with China in the American market. That led to a deterioration of the exchange terms in Central America, which is the contrary or the opposite to what happened in South America, and in particular the Andean countries. This is what happened basically in Latin America. The second point I would like to underline is that in the previous decade, the interest rate of the Federal Reserve was about 5, and in the last decade it was 2. So there was a decrease in the international interest rate, around 3 points approximately. And we can say that part of the debt crisis in Latin America during the 80s had to do with a high level of debt, but also with a huge increase of the interest rates in the United States. If something happened during that decade, was exactly the opposite in terms of a reduction in interest rates. So what happened in Latin America? The growth rate from 2000 to 2012 was about 3.5%. Here you can see some of the countries which grew more in the last 10 years. First of all, Peru, and then Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. On the left side, you have the period 1990 to 2012. Latin America grew by 3%, and Chile is the one that grew more if we take the last 20 years as a reference. These growth rates are very good for Latin America compared to its previous history. Growth rates are a lot better than in previous decades. They are not necessarily better than what happened in the rest of the developed world. It grew less than sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. But anyway, we can say that Latin America did good in terms of its past history, but maybe not so well if compared with other areas in the world economy. The economies that are doing less well in Latin America are actually the largest ones. Mexico, which is the one that grew the least in Latin America in the past 10, 15 years. And secondly, Brazil. Beyond all the comments in favor of Brazil, the growth rate in Brazil was below the Latin America average. If we take the Latin American average, and if we know that the two largest economy account for the 60% of the GDP, we can see that in Latin America we can see the opposite as from what we see in other emerging economies, for example, China and India, because in Latin America the largest economies are the ones that are growing more slowly. However, this is good news. Here you can see the inflation rates. In the case of Argentina, the rate was very low, whereas in Central America the rate was around 4%. There was a good behavior in the public sector. You can see here how the public debt went down everywhere, maybe with the exception of Mexico. Although this trend is more clear from 2008. Here you can see a line for Latin American and the Caribbean. The red one is South America, which went down very sharply. And in Central America, we can see also an important drop in debt. And this situation stabilizes from 2008. In any case, the rates are a lot lower than what they were in the beginning of the past decade. In order to make some promotion of Latin America, we can use this graph to compare Latin America with European countries with two variables. The gross public debt figure, and the other one would be the net investment position, considering the private sector and the international markets. So it would seem that Latin America, in terms of net position, it is better positioned than that of the most traumatic, so to say, part of Europe. We talk a lot about the current account also very much. There are several crises associated to the deterioration of the current account, and the question is, how could Latin America grow without important external restrictions? How was it possible for Latin America to grow for 5 or 6 years without having an important external restriction? Because in the past, when it grew, imports grew, and we faced that external restriction. So what happened? Well, the international prices changed. The price of oil increased a lot. Soy prices also increased very much, and therefore the external restriction went up. So that allowed for further growth without facing that external restriction that we are now facing. However, in the past, we had some space for the economy to grow before facing that external restriction. So here you can see the current account. There was a surplus in the first years, and until 2010, the deficit was not higher than 1 point. Today, it is about 2 points. But if you take the primary balance, as I call it, that is adding the direct foreign investment, that is one of the problems for finding the current account. Well, that is what is giving us a surplus today for Latin America. The question is what happened with the funding, the capital flow, etc. So I would like to focus on the blue bars. Those are the reserves. The reserves increased almost constantly. Basically, because from 2007, the countries, or some of the countries in the region, had a policy defending the exchange rate. That's why they were buying reserves, trying to avoid a greater increase of the exchange rate. Then we have the opposite argument that says that the countries did that because in the absence of a borrower, what Latin America did was to accumulate reserves for crisis, for the event of a crisis. So there was a precautionary measure, so to say, but at the same time we can say that the countries were really concerned about a great increase of the exchange rates. In the beginning of the decade, that was due to a surplus in the current account that was so big that, as you can see in the blue bars, there was a capital flight in Latin America. There was this surplus in the current account, and in the foreign investment, the capitals went out. So this is what caused the increase of the exchange rate, and now this is changing, and capital flows are now the factors that are creating the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease had to do with a great improvement in the export prices, and now prices are still high, but it has to do with an important national liquidity. I will talk about it later on. And to continue with the good news, here you can see what happens with the current account and the unemployment that is represented by the red line. The current account improved, then it deteriorated, but still the deficit is 1.5%, and the unemployment rate dropped from 11% to 6%. So Latin America grew and it generated employment. I'm almost done with the good news. But there have been very good things in the region. The buffer of international reserves was big. Look at the graph. The reserves increased from 7 to 14% of the product, and that was a trend in all the countries in the region. In terms of product, Chile and Peru have more reserves now, but in general there was an accumulation of reserves in the region. Here you have Chile and Peru, which are the ones which have accumulated more reserves. Now we can see what happened with poverty and income distribution. The good news is that this was the greatest poverty reduction ever in the history of Latin America. On the left side, you can see the percentage of poor people It used to be 44% in 2002, and today the figure is around 28%. The homeless people went to from 29% to 11%. So poverty reduction has been considerable. Here it is important to think if we are focusing on the picture or on the whole movie. So the picture tells us that the situation is still worrying, because even there was an important reduction, the poverty figures are still there. So why this poverty reduction? Well, there are three factors that can explain that. First of all is growth. Estimations show that this growth generated employment, and that accounted for 70% of the poverty reduction. All the 30% can be explained by two factors: an improvement in the income distribution, and the second one is the demographic bonus. What happened in the region is that the number of dependents per employee has been reduced. The birth rate has been reduced, and the number of employees have improved or have increased with regard to dependent person. So with the same level of income, there are less dependent people, and that is the phenomenon that is happening in the region. That depends on the country. For example, in Uruguay, the situation is over, but this is usually the trend in the Latin American countries, and it can explain the poverty reduction. There is also a better income distribution. On the left, you can see the Gini coefficient with a 45-degree line, and it compares 2002 with 2012. Those which are down below represent those which have a lower Gini coefficient. The ones on top of the line have a higher Gini. Those are Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic. Costa Rica used to have a low Gini coefficient. It got a little bit worse, and in the case of the Dominican Republic, we can say that the Gini coefficient has remained stable. Brazil is an example of bad distribution of income, but the Gini coefficient went down. I could say the same about Ecuador, Argentina, Bolivia, and many other countries which have improved their income distribution. Again, we have the picture and we have the movie. If we focus on the picture, we can say that Latin America, it is the least equal society in the world. This is in part due to the social policies. The social expenditure in the region increased from 12 points to 18.6 of the GDP from 1990 to 2010. The line that you can see in the middle is the participation of social expenditure on the total expenditure, which went from 45% to 62%. So the social expenditure increased actually more proportionally than the global expenditure. And that social expenditure has to do with health, education, etc. But it increased more than anything else in pensions and social assistance. Pensions in general. And we've seen the emergence of non-contributory pensions in Latin America. This factor was fundamental in some countries, such as in Brazil, in order to improve the income distribution, together with an important component in Latin America, which are the conditioned transfers, which started in Mexico in the mid-90s. And nowadays there are more than 100 million people in Latin America, mostly in Mexico and Brazil. They don't expand a lot in terms of GDP, only 0.4%. But those expenditures were very much focused on these sectors with the least resources. The third relevant factor for improving the income distribution was the gap between the salaries or the wages of skilled and unskilled labor. That gap increased in the 90s, and in the last decade that wage gap was decreased. Why? Because of two reasons. First of all, the offer of skilled labor increased. That is, the investment, the prior investment on education increased the offer of skilled labor. The second factor is that the demand of unskilled labor increased also. The economic growth was also related to the construction sector, and that is why. So we had both factors. On one side, an economy that created that gap between skilled and unskilled workers, and secondly, an economy whose social expenditure increased, very especially on pensions and conditioned transfers. And that explains basically the improvement in income distribution. So here you can see an overview. The last column is Latin America. The growth rate per capita was 2.3% in the last decade. Inflation 6.8%, with differences between Central America, South America, and Mexico. Public debt, as we saw before, was reduced by 21%. Which may account to 37% of the GDP today. The current account, the deficit is very high, in particular in Central America, but in the whole region the situation is different. Poverty was reduced by 25%, although the level is still high, 35%. Of the total population, and the Gini coefficient was also reduced, although it continues to have very high levels. So this is all about good news. Now I'm going to talk about some problems. The first problem has to do with equality, with equity, which is one of the greatest challenges in Latin America. And there are several reasons for that in terms of our income distribution. The first explanation, of course, is the inequality of income distribution, of wealth distribution. The access to assets is the first explanation. But what is the state's role? If we take into account the Gini coefficient variations in Europe, we can see that before the state's intervention, that is, before taxes and before public expenditure, and then if we compare afterwards, the Gini coefficient is reduced by 15% on average. Sorry, 15 points. That's how the Gini coefficient is reduced by the state's intervention. What happens in Latin America? Not much. Why? Because there are no relevant direct taxes, and the expenditure is not as distributive as it is in Europe. In Europe, this has to do with pensions and unemployment benefits. We don't have unemployment benefits in Latin America, and pensions don't have that base of solidarity that they have in Europe. So traditionally, pensions in Latin America have been distributed similarly to the income distribution. So here you can see what happens with the tax structure in Latin America. Here you have the income and the capital gains, which is about 25% of the whole collection. And general taxes on goods and services accounts for 35%. If you take a look at the middle column, you can see how the total tax revenue increased a lot, actually. But 60% of that increase is explained by tax on goods and services and basically VAT, that is indirect taxes that worsen actually the income distribution, and only 39% is accounted for or accounts for capital gains or direct taxation. That is a serious problem in Latin America. There are some shy attempts trying to correct this, but the resistance of the elites to change that in Latin America are very important. So the tax system is basically regressive. It's true that in Central America there are now taxes on capital, which is something really innovative in Latin America. In Uruguay, for example, there are taxes on capital gains, on dividends, on interests, and those don't exist in other countries of the region. So we have this problem in the tax structure, and then there is another problem related to expenditure. The expenditure in Latin America is more and more progressive, according to some reports, to some studies, because the expenditure on education and health is increasing. But actually this is bad news. Why? Because what we had was a very segmented and poor quality health system, and there was a lack of public health insurance, and people moved to the private sector. The same in education. Poor quality public education makes people go to the private sector. So if I measure how much I'm expending on health and on education, you will see that I spend more on the poor people, but that's for the wrong reasons, because of the bad quality of expenditure on health and education. So that is why this is partially, at least, a bad news. This is what we are witnessing now in Latin America. There is a lack of a universal social protection in health and education. So the result is a very segmented and unequal systems. There is first class, second class, third class education in health, and that doesn't contribute to equality, and it doesn't improve social cohesion either. The other problem has to do with the external sector. The external restriction disappeared, as I said, for a while at least, but it's coming back now. It's starting to come back. And partially it's coming back. I don't want to go into details here, but here you have the value, volume, and price of exports. In the last decade, the figure is 4.9. So if we underline the price, the volume of exports is increasing by 5% a year in the region. So what does this mean? There is a point when prices stop rising 5%. If an economy grows by 5%, the elasticity of short-term imports is the same. So for that 5%, we have imports growing by 10%. These are the exports of Latin America to the world. To Latin America and the Caribbean, United States, European Union. These are exports from Latin America towards these different regions. Here you can see China, which is at the top of the list. So we are not growing much in terms of volumes of exports. And as a result, the external restriction is still there. If the economy continues to grow by 4.5 or 5%, these restrictions are going to grow a lot faster. So one thing is to say that they're going to remain high, and then all the thing is to say that they're going to grow. So the external restriction is still there. The exports are not growing as fast as they should. And here you can see the deficits, which are growing in some countries. And to that we have to add the exchange rate from 2000 to 2012. And here you can see different trends. I explained the reasons before: a surplus on the current account, the capital inflow, monetary policies of the United States, of Great Britain, and now Japan, which are devaluating their currencies, and as a result, the other currencies in the world increase. That lack of governance I'm trying to recall something José Antonio Alonso said about the lack of governance in the world and macroeconomic coordination. The result of that is everyone is doing as best as they can, and many of them are trying to issue a lot in order to reactivate their economies. They devalue their currencies. And on the other side, we have the countries which are valuing their currencies, as the US. So here we can see the increase of currency values in most of the countries. The current account is deteriorated. These lines are moving more and more towards the left and downwards. The primary result is a little bit worse. Here we have the international liquidity, that is the rate for credit for the countries, for the Latin American countries, the ones which are below. That is the average of Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. It's a very low level. That is an advantage because they can finance themselves, but it can be a problem in the future. Because on the other side, we have Argentina and Venezuela who don't have access to international markets. The economies that have access to the markets, how do they solve that external restriction? Well, they value their currencies, their spread is very reduced, and they can finance the current account deficits because they have very low rates. Other countries, including Argentina, don't have that possibility. And they try to solve their problems with the external sectors by restricting imports or controlling exchange rates. So when there is no access to that financing market, the consequences are more restrictions to imports, trying to alleviate the pressure on the external sector. The other problem I can see here is related to the exporting structure. Here you have a graph of primary products and manufactured products based on natural resources. It's obvious that this increased because prices increased. It went from 68 to 75% from 2000 to 2010. And it's true, if we take constant values that we can see on the right, there used to be 68, now it's 68. So there is a price phenomenon to explain this return to the production of primary goods for exports. This is the case particularly in Brazil, but in the rest of the region we cannot see this very clearly. But if the prices continue in this line, that's the way we are going. We can discuss a little bit more about this, but this is clearly the trend which is very clear in Brazil, as I said. The other one is a great hope for Latin America, China and Southeast Asia. It's been an extraordinary aid, but we don't have to get messed up. This is what we export to China. Blue bars represent pure primary goods. Sorry, that is the brown. And the blue is the manufactured products based on natural resources. So that is the structure of the exports to China. This is the present, and I'm afraid that it will be the future situation as well. Basically, because the customs in China are not very different from other countries. It's very protectionist. In general, the Southeast Asia is, and China in particular. So we are starting this process of returning to the production of primary good. And we can see important customs protections. And finally, I'm going to end with a comment on education and innovation. The region has moved forward a great deal in terms of health coverage. There are issues, of course, in terms of health and education, as I said, particularly in the secondary coverage level. These problems remain in many countries. It is a serious problem in Central America, but this has increased. It has increased, but the quality of education hasn't increased. Latin America has very poor results in all international tests, not only in comparison with the developed world, but also in comparison with other emerging or developing countries in Asia. We can discuss the way tests are performed, but in general, results are very poor. When it comes to innovation, the country is showing very poor results too. This doesn't mean that there are no attempts or improvements. There have been some attempts in Brazil and in Argentina. The innovation policies have improved, I think, although there are some problems still. But anyway, we are moving very slowly. We have very poor resources for innovation, and the incentives are wrong, in my opinion. Well, some of you were looking at me with a strange face when I said wrong, but according to international reports, we're not doing too bad when it comes to production. But when it comes to patents, our results are not so good. I know patents may not be the best measure for innovation, but anyway, they can give us a partial, maybe, idea. But here we can see what happened with the patents in the last decade. In China, they were multiplied by 20. In India, by 10. And, in other countries, I don't have the figures here, but we can say that Australia increased or doubled the rate. But in Latin America, we have a 47% increase, but that is explained by Brazil mostly. They increased a little bit in Mexico and then a very tiny bit in Chile, but that's all. So it's true. If we want to do something more than copying, but also adapting technologies, we have to be able to have researchers who can create. You cannot adapt all the time unless you have people who can innovate and create. And I think the region didn't move forward enough in that area. We have problems with our productive structure. We have a risk of coming back to producing primary goods. And I have the feeling we're not doing enough, or we are not taking the opportunity we have now in order to lay the foundations for a more sustained growth when we have a more favorable international context. Thank you very much.